Good morning, human geography students. This is group 5, and we covered two documentaries. One, Inside Job, the other is The Secret History of the Credit Card. Pretty much both are kind of intertwined in themselves. The Secret History of the Credit Card is kind of a smaller scale of what happened in Inside Job, but the director for Inside Job is a man by the name of Charles Ferguson. He does some very controversial documentaries. Um, in 2013, he was asked by the government to shut down a documentary he was doing about Hillary Clinton. So he had to stop doing that. But very good public information if you ever get a hold of his documentary films. But I named our screencast "We Are the Laughing Stock," talking about Americans pretty much. And you'll understand the naming of this screencast at the end of the screencast. And I have Bane here and Zorro, kind of great depictions of people bringing the corruption to justice and giving the power back to the people, which we really needed during these times and actually kind of still do. Now let's get started here in post 1930. After the Great Depression, the government and the Federal Reserve decide to regulate banks, which means they are going to oversee everything the banks do with depositors' money. Depositors' money is the money that you go and you put in your checking and your savings account, the money that you deposit in there. The bank collects it all and can usually makes investments with it. But if they have regulations over it, they either A, can't invest it, or B, they have to invest it very, very closely. Um, and this was going well until about 1981, and that was when Ronald Reagan came to be president, and this was during his era, is kind of when the financial virus began. And it began with this man right here, Donald Reagan. And Donald Reagan proposed an idea to Ronald Reagan stating, hey, man, we should deregulate the banks. We should let the banks do whatever they want with depositors' money. And one bank in particular was the Lincoln Savings and Loan Bank, which was headed by this man by the name of Charles Keating. Now, Charles Keating was under investigation by the government because this is back when regulations were still going on. And he was doing some funny stuff with depositors' money. He was making some weird investments, some probably illegal investments. And so what he did was he hired this man by the name of Alan Greenspan. Now, Alan Greenspan is a major, major player in how all this stuff went down. He was the main advocator of deregulation of banks. Okay? And Charles Keating hired Alan Greenspan, who was an economist, a professional economist at the time, to write a letter on his behalf in court stating that what he was doing with depositors' money was legal and that everything was okay. And despite Alan Greenspan's letter, Charles Keating went to jail anyway. But Alan Greenspan got hired by the Ronald Reagan administration. And after he got hired by the Ronald Reagan administration, he actually survived three more administrations, Bill Clinton's administration and George W. Bush's administration. And he did have a play in Obama's administration, not a big one, but a little small one. And he's kind of actually still around today. But to really understand how this crisis happened, you have to understand what a derivative is. A derivative is a report of pretty much anything, and it's a contrast of the past and present, and is made up of professional mathematics or mathematicians and economists, and they come together and they put this report out. And this report is a hot commodity item to investors because then investors will know what they can pretty much invest their money in. It's actually more or less, in smaller terms, a gambling tool for big businesses and investors and bankers to use to gamble money. Now, these derivatives were being bought and sold like hotcakes. And this lady right here, her name is Brooksley Born. She was part of the Clinton administration, and she said, "Hey, maybe we should start regulating these derivatives because these derivatives are getting kind of out of control. Because these banks are doing whatever they want to with depositors' money, and these derivatives aren't necessarily accurate. And these banks are following these derivatives and are making a lot of bad investments with depositors' money." And so she started advocating to get the derivatives regulated. Now, this man right here is Larry Summers. And Larry Summers was in the political realm. And what he did was he called Brooksley Born's teammate, Michael Greensberger, and said, "Yo, Michael, look, man, I got these bankers that are in my office, and they're about to lose a lot of money if you start regulating derivatives. You cannot regulate derivatives. You must deregulate derivatives." And 2 years after Brooksley Born said, "Hey, we should regulate these derivatives," they passed a an act. It's called the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which stated there was to be no regulation on derivatives whatsoever. You could do whatever you wanted with these derivatives. And so the derivatives were up and going at this point. There was no regulation on them. Now, to explain to you how regulation works and deregulation works, regulation works like this. This is a cargo tanker, an oil tanker, if you will. And in this cargo boat, you have to put certain oil barrels in certain places because of the weight distribution in order for the boat to float on the water correctly. That's regulation. Now, deregulation is putting oil barrels of different sizes in any compartment you want to, and this causes the cargo boat to capsize because of the weight distribution is off. That's just a little example. Now let's go to the home buying. Home buying, the old way back in the day, is that a lender would lend a home buyer some money, which is called a mortgage, and the home buyer would just pay the lender that amount of money, and that's it. Now, these economists decided, hey, we need to, put more security with these mortgages, and what we need to do is create a new system. And what the new system is that the lender that lends you the money, the mortgage, they would sell that to a bank. And what a bank would do is it would comprise all of these loans, not necessarily your loans. There's a different people's loans. There's a lot of them: student loans, car loans, your mortgage, your credit card loans, just different types of loans, and this thing called a CDO. Um, and then what the banks would do with this CDO is sell it to an investor. Okay, so pretty much all these people were getting a chunk of your money if you were paying off your mortgage. But the most prosperous out of all these would be the banks. And I'm going to explain that to you right here for the housing bubble. Okay? What's happening with the housing bubble is the financial virus was spreading through all these quote unquote faulty loans that these bankers were giving out. And what this was is most of these loans were comprised with a 5 year affordable loan, with the next 2 years being interest rates out the roof. Like there would be no way that you could afford these these mortgages or these loans after the 5th year. And they were doing this to draw people in and getting them in the bank so they could give these loans out. And what these bankers were doing was they were getting commission off these faulty loans that they were giving to people, and it was millions upon millions and millions of dollars. People were partying on yachts. They had like 4 or 5 mansions, penthouses everywhere. They were balling, and what they were balling off of was these faulty loans they were giving to everybody, and they knew that they were bad loans. And this is how the housing bubble grew, was from all these faulty loans. Now, what the banks were doing whenever they got a CDO, which was a collateralized debt obligation, which were your student loans, your mortgage, your car loans, your credit card loans. All of your loans were in the CDO. But the thing is that these banks went out and they paid a rating company to rate these CDOs as being AAA ratings, which AAA ratings is the best rating that you can put on a loan. But the thing is that these loans were bad loans, and they were selling these AAA subprime loans, is what they were called. That's what you call a loan that's really, really bad. They were selling these AAA subprime loans to investment companies, knowing that they were bad. And to go further into it, what these banks were doing as well was they were getting these insurance companies to cover these bad loans for when the loan went bad, they would still be able to get money. It's pretty messed up, but try to follow me here. Now, what happened was after the 5th year of these mortgages going out, the interest rate hits. And the interest rate hits, and these people cannot afford these loans anymore, which means they weren't able to pay their mortgage, which means the banks weren't able to get their money. And so the banks didn't have any money, and people went homeless locally because they weren't able to afford their mortgages because of these faulty loans. And then globally, it stopped manufacturing because again, banks didn't have any money. 10 million migrant workers were out of work. State and nationally, companies went out of business. Even they started having to downsize. They started having to lay people off. Which, I mean, our economy's kind of bouncing back right now, but not really. I mean, they're kind of just staying in there in the same area. But it was just a devastating effect. These people were getting these loans that they thought they could afford. These bankers were polishing them up to make them look really good, and they were really bad. And unfortunately, the CEOs of these banks were never brought into custody. There were no repercussions of this to anybody. If anything, the CEOs kind of got a bonus. They either got severance packages because their banks went out of business, but they got like $500 million severance packages, or they went into politics and became a secretary of treasury somewhere, or an economist for some politician, and are still making money today, or making over $300,000 a year, if not more than that, probably more than that. They make like $150,000 just to write a report saying something's good, that they should invest, that you should invest your money in that. And it's terrible because they took advantage of so many Americans and caused all this bad in the economy, and never not one of them was arrested for it at all. And even the government had a hand in doing everything, because what happened was is that the Federal Reserve then kind of bailed the banks out. They bailed the banks out, and the banks were pretty much giving these faulty loans to people, knowing that the Federal Reserve was going to bail them out at some point. And it's just a lot of corruption, so much corruption. And well, let's move on. Let's move on to the second field, the secret history of the credit card. This is a smaller version of the housing bubble, but same type of corruption. Seahawks Falls, South Dakota, was just a little small one-horse town, uh, full of cow auctioneers. I mean, there wasn't really a lot of going on. I mean, there was some wealthy people, but not a whole lot. But there was people there that wanted to spend their money, and what better way to do that than at a bank? And they didn't really have that big of a bank there. So the Citibank in New York City found out about this, and they were about to go out of business. And they brokered a deal with the city of Seahawks Falls and said, "Hey, look, we'll bring 10,000 jobs to your city, to your little town, if just as long as the people there put the money back into our bank." And how they were going to do this is by putting out a thing called a credit card. And a credit card was regulated at at the very beginning, but then they passed this bill called the Marquette Bill, which deregulated all credit card. And in 2003, $1.5 trillion in credit card charges uh, were uh, collected as data, and it's just a lot of money. $1.5 trillion in credit cards. It's nuts. But many of these people still actually owe on their credit cards. But there was a lot of people that paid their credit cards off. 50 million Americans actually paid their credit cards off. But these people are actually called deadbeats. They're called deadbeats in the financial world because they don't have to pay any interest. And the people in the financial world don't like this. And you'll see why in just a second. But there was a man by the name of Andrew Carr. And Andrew Carr kind of changed the game up as far as credit card advertisements and credit cards that the bank gives you. What he said was, he was like, "Hey, look, let's put on the advertisement that we either give 0% interest rate, a 2% interest rate, or a 5% interest rate, which is a really low interest rate on the first 6 months of these customers having this credit card." And which was a really good idea. I mean, the credit cards were they were being you know sold, I guess you could say, to a lot of people, thinking that they were going to have these really really low interest rates. But the problem is that a lot of people didn't read their credit card contract. And in the credit card contract, it stated that if they went late, like on their first payment, or actually any payment, that they would hike up the interest rate all the way up to like 29%. And it's kind of what a default rate. It means that if you go late on a payment, then the the credit card company could make up its own interest rate and slap it on your bill, and that's how much you would have to pay. And even on top of all this, you have to have fees. They get you with fees too. They get you with installment fee. They get you with a convenience fee, which I don't understand that. A convenience fee. They're charging you a convenience fee for you paying your own credit card bill. That kind of didn't make any sense to me. Um, and then they also charge you a late fee, which I don't understand either. Because if someone's late on their payment, why would you charge them more money if they're late? That doesn't make any sense either to me. Um, but these credit card contracts also are very long, small worded documents that people don't really necessarily read. And there's a reason why they're like that, because they're full of hidden things like changing the interest rate on you. Um, and also, they could find something after having a credit card with a credit card company for, like, let's say 6 years, and you've never been late on your payment. If the credit card company finds something that happened 15 years ago in your credit report that you were late on something, they can just change the interest rate and hike it up to like 29% and slap it on your credit card bill, and you would have to pay it. I mean, it's ridiculous. They can pretty much do whatever they wanted to. And one of these major examples that were in the film was Providian Bank. And what Providian Bank was doing was mainly targeting people that didn't have a great credit score. And these people were promised, low interest rates. And about after the first year or so of having a credit card with them, they would hike the interest rate up to like 29% out of nowhere. And there was really nothing these people can do about it. And it was quite ridiculous. The OCC, which is the main regulator of the banks, had to step in and say, hey, this is wrong. You don't need to be doing this to people. And kind of got that situation figured out, more or less. But this still goes on today. I mean, it hasn't stopped. But locally, 7 million families filed for bankruptcy because they can't afford their credit card bills. I mean, these people um, lost their jobs, during the 2008 financial crisis, and they pretty much had to rely on these credit cards to support them uh, in their life until they got a job. And when they got a job, they really couldn't afford the credit card payments that they had built up on their credit card because the interest rate was so high, and it's quite ridiculous. State and nationally, the government regulations can continue to be influenced by the banks, and globally, chain reaction of deregulation to wide expanse of credit led to more manufacturing jobs and more products being consumed by the public. And I mean, just to put everything in one big conclusion, is that these companies and these people, these CEOs, these politicians, they really do not have you in mind as far as when finances are concerned. They're always trying to take your money, and if they're not trying to take your money, they're trying to take your money. There was a Chinese man in the film. I forgot, he was part of the Chinese government, but he said, engineers build bridges, and you only pay them maybe 50 to 100 grand a year, but financial engineers get paid $400 million every year, and financial engineers build dreams that eventually turn into nightmares that we, the people, have to pay for. And that is it.